Good afternoon. Great privilege to welcome all of you here. I know how busy everyone at Ashoka is, and I'm sure you'll join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Ullas Karanth, who's probably done more work on tigers, published more on their ecology, their conservation than anyone anywhere on earth. It's a great privilege that he's not only here at Ashoka, but the Ashoka Archives, which is one floor where we are. It's in the basement of this building. The Ashoka Archives of Contemporary India, set up 5 years ago, has collections of over 60 key figures in contemporary history of India. And among them is Dr. Ullas Karanth. So the record of his writing, his diary, his letters. We are privileged to have Dr. Karanth here for 3 reasons. We all like to say that Ashoka represents a different and new way of learning, which is syncretic, where different fields of knowledge respect one another. Nobody exemplifies that better than Dr. Karanth, because he began, many of you may not know, as a civil engineer. In his 30s, he decided that his vocation was biology. He went into a master's and a doctorate, and he worked on the ecology of the tiger, particularly in Nagarhole. Over the last 30 years, he has published extensively on the tiger, but much more as important as that, he has contributed to new ways of studying tigers in the wild, of estimating what they do, how many there are, and how best to save them. So that's the second very important point. He's tried to apply his knowledge in the real world, and as often is the case, he has a lot of friends, and may he have many more. But when you speak in public, you also have adversaries. I won't call them enemies, because that's not a word we like to use. But he has been a very forceful advocate of having systems of conservation which are founded on science. And whether one agrees with him or not, he has been someone who has brought informed science into public debate, not only in English, but in Kannada. And this book is a remarkable book because it is called Among Tigers, Fighting to Bring Back Asia's Cats. It's of course the story of the tiger, but as I'm sure you've guessed, it's also the story of his own encounter, not only with tigers, but with public life and conservation. So on behalf of the Environment Studies Group, very small department, very rich in terms of diversity. We have people from sciences, social sciences, humanities. On behalf of both the archives and Environment Studies and Ashoka, very warm welcome. We're all looking forward to it.
It's always a pleasure to talk to young people. I was in the campus for a day and a half, and it was buzzing with energy and took me back 50 years to my own youth. So it's always great to talk to young people because they are curious, unlike we golden oldies who are bored with life and generally disinterested in it. So I'm going to talk about tigers, but tiger is basically a symbol in the story. In a sense, it's a story of recovering wild nature, saving what it is, stemming, arresting the loss of nature, and then bringing back. So tiger symbolizes that, and it captures a lot of other things. So tiger is something I have been interested as a kid. So it's not really about the tiger in a sense. I then broaden the scope to a kind of examination of issues related to how do we save wild nature. And fundamentally, there are 2 species of conservationists, and a lot of them say we just wind the clock back and go, and that's how we save nature. And a few others like us saying we can't wind the clock back, we have to ride this beast of growth and technology, and in that context we have to save wild nature. So I kind of pitch for the second view in this talk at the end. I've also worked across tiger range at different levels. I have worked with extensively in Thailand for the last 20-25 years in what is probably the largest wilderness complex in Southeast Asia. And I have also been to the Russian Far East. As I said, tiger symbolizes this wild nature in very many different ways. And we go quickly look at the context of this other biodiversity in India vis-a-vis the tiger. India, for no reason that any human being had anything to do, is a repository of incredible biodiversity. Because 68 million years ago, a continent broke up, created the Himalayas, And then we had this incredible biodiversity within political boundaries of one nation, which came much later. We have like 13% of the, we occupy only 2.5% of the world's surface, but we have 17%, 13% of the world's birds, 24% of the world carnivores, 7% of all mammals. So all this is packed in. And when we recognize our heritage as Taj Mahal and something else, we just don't think of this in that frame at all. How lucky we are to be born here, simply because of our geographic position. Just to capture this, those of you who are probably deep into biology would know this. We have Asian species like the dhole, we have the tiger, we have the rhino, single-horned, one-horned rhinoceros. But we also have African species like the leopard, the striped hyena, and the lion. And we also have the temperate zone species. You would be surprised to say we have grizzly bears, we have red fox, and the elk in India. The Kashmir stag is nothing but the elk. So this tremendous biodiversity is captured in a few slides. Birds, incredibly, and reptilians. I'm not into those species, but also the same areas that hold all this wild biodiversity are also watersheds, repositories of our rivers. Much of our agriculture depends on this. So there are very, very strong utilitarian reasons for our own good that we have to certainly save this. The other thing is these creatures are not saved separately in enclosures. That's one way, the zoo and the germplasm branch. But there's an interaction going on there. These ecological processes like dispersal of seeds, pollination of pollinators that connect different plants. So all this can only be saved in situ, that is in position. It can't be. Some people mistake that we have gene banks and we'll recreate the If you have seen Jurassic Park too much, you think of a different world. But the processes need to be saved, and it can only be done in the wild. And this requires saving large areas. When I say large areas, I go back to the point that if you look at all the areas protected for wildlife in the world today, it is less than 5%. So it's not that we are making a huge sacrifice and become refugees because wildlife is being saved. That's not the case. But even within the remaining 5 or 10%, you need large landscapes if you are to save these connected ecosystems. Another comparison, because everybody aspires to go to United States, we occupy 1/3 of the area. We have 4 times as many people. And about till recently, and perhaps even now, 60% of these people lived off the land and were in some way dependent on natural systems for agriculture, and this picture captures it. See how much of it comes from the forest. And these 60% are also poor. Their income levels are low as opposed to US. So on top of this, now, particularly post Narasimha Rao, we have a modern economy the size of France that's growing at 6-7%, and all the. So both are in existence, and in this context, we have to save what is wild nature. We have to understand this because there's often portrayed that saving nature is a luxury, we can't afford it, etc. So in this context, we have about 10%. I'm basically dealing with terrestrial species, not marine. We have only about 10% of the land under some kind of natural cover. Rest has been modified irreversibly. It's unlikely to go back to nature anytime soon, this transformation through agriculture and things like that. And out of that 10%, only about 4% of the total area of India is earmarked for nature conservation, just 4%. Because we pride ourselves on our ancient culture and reverence for nature. I'm just pointing that out. The same people who say all these things are cribbing about this 4%. Why should we save Kudremukh National Park. You know, it should be given out for farming or whatever. So we have this. So as a conservationist, which I was first before I became a biologist, I'm uncompromising on this. I don't think there's any room left to bargain about this 4% to further whittle it down. There's a strong case to be made to expand it. So, and even this 4%, if you look at de facto protection with enforcement machinery in place and the animals actually in some reasonable numbers, we are talking about 1 or 2%, not more. It's not a big sacrifice that a country with the $5 trillion economy as a goal should be cribbing about. But I find a lot of people cribbing about protected areas. And I mean, this is so drastic, I don't see where's the big negotiating point to bring it down further. And this shows the same thing. The top picture shows the forest cover as it was. As you can see, only the Rajasthan desert and the mountainous areas are not green. Rest was all forest of one kind or the other. Next picture to it shows the current state of just forest cover. And the picture at the bottom left shows the Malanad landscape where I work in Karnataka, the mountainous region of Karnataka. And you see how little forest is left. And on the right shows a single tiger reserve, Kali Tiger Reserve, and all the red dots represent human settlements. So the interspersion of this growth, rural poverty, a fragmented nature, and how do you recover tigers is in some sense a challenge towards which Africa, Latin America are all heading. In some sense, we are already at the cutting edge of the problem, and if we can solve it here, it's relevant to a lot of biodiversity conservation in the world, in many places in the world. The demands on the nature, in some sense, include rural demands like biomass from the natural areas, use of natural areas, burning of them for raising cattle or improving pastures. A lot of non-timber forest products, which are often proposed as a solution, are actually as lethal or getting worse than logging, because the harvest is on a completely unsustainable scale given the size of these resources. What is not realized is these resources were exploited by a small number of communities for local survival and subsistence. Now there are global markets linked to it. This is a Garcinia found in the Western Ghats, which suddenly found it turned out to be a great cure for obesity, and some drugs reducing obesity were made from it, and suddenly the exploitation boomed, traditionally used only for curries, and then there's this global market. So what we forget in all this is this: not only are these natural areas in the middle of this, they are linked to a powerful economic driver, the global market. In whatever form, starting with the exploration for the spices which the naval powers in the West did, to this day, market penetrates everywhere. I think it's futile to pretend that it doesn't. And that's why ecologists should study at least some economics. Then we, as a part of the bigger, those pressures I talked about are rural, originating in rural livelihoods or whatever. These pressures are also, we had to feed a hungry country. We needed electricity. So mega dams came and they took away a chunk of it. And this remains a threat, although we have tapped out most of the optimal reservoirs. Mining, this is Kudremukh National Park at one time. So mines, all these come from this other sector where economic growth, which everybody wants, is happening. I'm just describing the threats. We want a modern highway system, but it's also passing through these 3% areas in many cases. And that has tragic consequences because these areas have very small populations, and the modern highway system cutting through them poses a challenge. So these are the modern sector's challenges. Then we have the green threat. Everybody is fashionably green these days, but the problem is the three proposed major green energy sources, I don't have a picture of one of them, are microhydels, which are penetrating the remotest areas. opening up roads, opening up to people's penetration, particularly in Northeast. Mahesh and I were on the Forest Advisory Committee. Remotest streams in Uttarakhand, Himachal, there are these projects coming up, micro-hydel, small hydel projects. Wind power, taking over massive swaths of the deserts and even the plains. It's green, but it's taking over wild lands from the bustards and whatever lives there, wolves. It's on a massive scale. So the other one actually is wind, solar, and so they kind of captured their microhydel. So this is about large-scale habitat conversion, which is going on under the label of green. Now we have to think about everything very clearly. That's why I'm pointing out these things. And of course, then there is hunting. Why are these animals scarce over most of Asia? Is because of hunting. It comes in two forms. One is commercial, in the sense, for example, rhino horn or tiger bones have a demand in China and certain parts. So what happens there is the market and the consumers are far away. But the low end of that whole chain is the local villager. He's the one finally who goes and sets the trap that catches the tiger. The second thing is protein-related hunting. People hunted. I grew up in a village called Puttur, which is 50 kilometers from Bengaluru in the 1950s. Everybody went hunting in the evening. Whoever had guns went hunting. And the need was for protein. So they would, and Africa, this is widely prevalent in Congo and everywhere, because the animal protein comes from hunting, not from farmed meat. I mean, sitting here, it looks odd to you, but this is the reality. And this is the reality why today Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Arunachal Pradesh, all Nagaland, you don't see animals. You have beautiful trees, the most extensive forests, they are empty forests because the animals in them have been hunted for protein. So, two kinds of hunting. So, given this background, I am now going to focus more on the tiger. Tigers once occupied 30%, 30 countries, and everywhere east to west, from about Iraq to, if you go northeast to Vladivostok, and from Armenia all the way to Bali. They had a wide distribution. Today that distribution has shrunk by 93%. So where tigers are found today is only 7% of where tigers were found just 200 years ago. So there's been this drastic range contraction because these species come into conflict with us. They eat livestock, they need vast territories to survive in, the prey animals, the livestock compete with the prey animals. There are a number of causes, but the reality is they are occupying 7% of the range. And if you look at effectively protected populations, it is about 3 or 4% of that 7%. It's that low. So if somebody says that's too much space for the tiger, I don't see the logic in that statement. When I was growing up, one of the things that got me involved with tigers passionately was tigers so deeply rooted in Hindu traditions, both the Dravidian and the Sanskritic modes of Hinduism. We have this Hulivesha, the tiger dance on the left. Then we have spirits or bhutas, which are in the form of tigers. This is the bottom picture is from Central India, tribal. So tiger was everywhere. They didn't have Uber. They all rode tigers. Ayyappa Swami, Mahadeshwara, Durga, they all rode tigers. So it was deeply in our culture, and sometimes modern conservationists ignore the role of tradition. Some go to the other extreme, say that's enough, people revere the tiger, we don't have to do anything, they'll say it. I don't agree with that. But the point is, this deep cultural reverence exists, provides a very strong foundation for building a modern conservation movement. The two are different, but the same people who do that, now they're coming in a new form, the urban people of India or even rural areas, the more affluent people are developing an interest in conservation. Typically, you go to a national park or somewhere, this is the scene you see, which is a very hopeful sign. This is not something you see in any other country. So, conservation is about three things: recovering endangered species, sustainably harvesting some species like fish, and dealing with the problems caused to humanity by wildlife. All three are a part of conservation. Conservation is very different from feeling sorry for Bambi, giving bread to street dogs, or any of those cute things people do. Conservation has all three elements. And if it is recovery or harvest or even elimination, the foundation has to be science. Because conservation is a field just like agriculture or medicine, where you use basic sciences, but you actually apply it to solve these three problems, depending on which is the problem in a locality. So science is fundamental. So as I was growing up in 1964, I had to choose. You become a doctor or an engineer. I wanted to become neither. And I was very clear, but there was no other option. I was very keen. I had learned birding at the age of 8, and I wanted to do something about wildlife. And there didn't exist a career, so I went to National Institute of Technology, Surathkal, hated every minute of it. I bunked classes and went to Nagarhole on my bike. I was in the bottom 5% of the grades, etc. All my classmates and friends are all great stars in industry today. K.V. Kamath was Brick Bank chairman. We all used to ride motorcycles together to college. So, but one thing happened. I had a lot of time not to read textbooks, and Life magazine, which was a large format magazine of the Time group, had an article. I had read every hunting book. I had Corbett, Kenneth Anderson, every book. And I was unsatisfied. They didn't answer any basic questions about the tiger, except describing it qualitatively. I read a 1.5-page article by Dr. George Schaller. He had come to Kana in 1962-63, spent 18 months, but he was a trained biologist with a PhD in wildlife biology. And he asked the questions, he had the methods, and in that 1.5 years, what he found out about tigers surpassed all these 200 years of tiger tales by the hunters, because he took it with a view of science. How do you collect quantitative data, and how do you, and that appealed to me, because as an engineer, I had that problem-solving mindset. Engineers don't read widely. They are told, solve this problem, and you must need to know only this much to solve this problem within this budget. So Schaller's study was a multi-species study, tiger and prey. So it became very clear to me, I was just 19, that I had to do this. But there was no way I could start doing it because I was not qualified. So I worked in the Robert Bosch Corporation, MICO, for 2 years. It was like a jail. It was like a prisoner of war camp. I escaped. Then I became a tractor salesman, and I drove across Karnataka on my motorcycle selling expensive tractors to farmers, but I spent more time outdoors. I said, no, I really want to watch animals. I gave up all that, bought a farm, and farmed for 8 years. And most people think it was, sometimes I also think this were wasted years. But now looking back, I think those years that I spent selling tractors and farming were what they didn't teach you in Harvard Business School. I learned so much about the Indian society, how it functions, the caste system, without studying it in theory, but watching it in action. And this whole romantic notion that villagers will protect the forest, they were hammering it away. So I was an eyewitness for 8 years, and I saw this. Then I got my lucky break. I was in University of Florida, and very quickly George Schaller came, and he liked what I was doing, and he hired me and said, suddenly I had a job and a mandate to study tigers for the rest of my life if I wanted. So that was in 1988. So I read the article in 1966, and I started doing what I wanted to do in 1988. So lesson is, don't be impatient. If you don't like something, do something else. Don't think it's too late in your careers to do something crazy. I've done the craziest thing and it worked. So the key thing about putting science into tiger conservation is to understand the fact that a tiger needs one large prey animal a week. It kills one large prey like this a week. That means 50 large animals in a year. And that's the dividend income. To produce those 50 animals, you need a base population of 500 prey. So for one tiger to live, it needs a prey base of 500 prey. So it was very clear the prey in Nagarhole were chital, sambar, gaur, without steroids. Look at the body. So the first step I did was to apply a method called distance sampling, which had not been, it had been developed in the West but not used in India, as my masters to look at the prey base. Because once you know how much prey there is, roughly dividing it by 500 will tell you how many tigers can live there. Even to this day, the government is not doing this. This basic science. Distance sampling is a standard method. I applied it for the first time in India, developed this, and the results were astounding. Because when I studied tropical biology in Florida, the story is Latin America and India, Asian forests are poor habitats for large hoofed animals because they are forested, there's not enough grasslands, and Kenya and Tanzania, that's where the maximum biomass of ungulates was. Our data showed it was wrong. We had in Nagarhole, after 30 years of protection, the same density and ungulate biomass as Tanzania's Serengeti or Uganda's best parks. So Asian forests are very different because unlike our evolutionary history, ungulate species are wide and abundant in Asia, different species in, whereas you go to Latin America, by then there are only 2 or 3 deer species. So it's a very different system. Our tropical forests are rich in ungulates. And these numbers are astonishing, like 40, 50 deer or prey animals. This is all prey combined. The second thing this graph shows is, this is Bandipur and Nagarhole. They have been protected for 4 or 5 decades. So they have very high densities of prey. But these are parks that got protection later, Bhadra, BRT, Anchi Dandeli. So conservation is a long game. It takes 30, 40 years of rigid protection before the prey bounces to its natural levels. The forest looks empty otherwise. The next step was actually to study tigers. This is what I wanted to do. And by then, in the mid-60s, Cochrane had invented in University of Minnesota radio tracking animals, the technique for small collars that are attached to animals. And luckily for me, this is the reason I went to Florida. Mel Sundquist was my advisor, was one of the first pioneers of radio tracking. And when the Smithsonian Institution offered India a project on a platter to study tigers using telemetry in Kana, unfortunately our bureaucrats felt very threatened and said, we don't want it. And it went to Nepal. That's how the tiger project began in Nepal, and Mel Sundquist was the first person to radio track tigers. So I did it 10 years later in Nagarhole for the first time in India, and in my book, Among Tigers, I have described all the thrills and pains and perils of doing this. But catching tigers, collaring them was a very new technique and very exciting technique. It took me into the world of tigers. My day began at 6 and I worked through the day. Sometimes I did all-night tracking, and people think tracking tigers is exciting. It's most boring because all you hear are the signals. Because the tigers for the first 6 months were virtually invisible. People say, I haven't seen a tiger. I didn't see a wild tiger in Nagarhole for 17 years. I saw the first one after 7. They are there, but you don't see them because they are shy. They have been harassed by people. So I did, with telemetry, within 6 months, gradually they got used to my vehicle, not me. But if I was in the car and I could triangulate the position and go and wait, they started ignoring my car. So after 6 months, they were like the tigers you see in Ranthambore or wherever, but it's only these 4 tigers and 3 leopards. Others were still shy. And if I got out of the car, they'll run away because they're afraid of people. But it took me into the world of tigers. This picture was not shot by me, but I've seen things like this when I was radio tracking tigers. This is a tourist video taken from Bandipur by somebody. It captures the tiger's power and what a lethal animal it is. And if you recommend your school kid wander around one, you should watch this video. Thank you. Okay. The other part of it was watching hunting is one thing, but the core part of a carnivore biologist's job is to, you then find kills of animals made by tigers. They give a lot of information on the health of the prey, how much meat they ate, were they vulnerable in some way. And even more important, because detection of kills is biased by the size and location of the kill, we collected tiger droppings. That was the big thing. The only human beings in the world who enjoy looking and smelling tiger poop and wild dog poop are carnivore biologists. It's awful, but for us it's like going to a library, you know, it's a wonderful experience. So the other thing is, how do tigers communicate? In the size of a city as big as Greater Delhi, there may be 10 tigers in the forest. They don't have email, they don't have Facebook, they don't have any way to communicate. How do they maintain this complex society of resident females with territories, males that have overlapping ranges, kids are kicked out at the age of 18 months. They maintain communication, and the central way they do it is through scent marking. They put these scent marks everywhere. Every scent mark has information about the individual and roughly what time the scent was deposited. So if a female is in east-west, the male will follow them. If the cub is somewhere, find its mother. And if there's an intruder in a territory, it will dodge the resident. All this happens with this chemical communication, which is so sophisticated compared to anything we have evolved since then. It also gave me information about the size of territories. I won't go into detail. We found out that resident female territory is only 20 square kilometers in Nagarhole. My colleagues were studying, Dale Mikkel was studying tigers in the Russian Far East. There it was 600 square kilometers. So Nagarhole could pack in 25 female tigers. If it were in Russia, one single female could live in Nagarhole. So not only our forests are diverse, but they have extraordinary prey density, which enables us to pack a lot of carnivores. Just to give tigers, lions in the best habitats, they can reach these densities, very high densities, because of these small territories, and more animals can be packed in. So I was getting into all this, also fighting with the government, which I written about this collaring and telemetry. Then a big wave of threat came, and this was the Chinese medicine trade. Finally exhausted the tigers in Southeast Asia and started hitting our parks. And it was making a real dent on the population, but officials were denying it, saying no, nothing is wrong. So this is because they were using a method of counting called pug mark census, which was developed by Saroj Chowdhury in 1968 or 69. It didn't work. But in a bureaucracy, when the senior guy invents something, it becomes a religion very quickly. So there was a whole monasteries teaching this bug mark sensors, and people went out and counted tigers that fundamentally flawed both biologically and statistically, but nobody could say emperor has no clothes. And I said that, and I was not very popular. So that was the negative side. But I also felt I had to do something. And luckily at that time, these cheap camera traps had just been invented for deer hunters in North America. People wanted to hunt the bucks with big antlers. So they developed these cheap cameras triggered electronically. So hunters put them out and saw where the big bucks came and went and waited and shot them there. But I saw it in a conference, technical conference. I said, this is great for camera trapping tigers. Because I knew the stripes were different. This was very well known that the stripes have enough statistical information to identify individuals. So we started developing camera trap methodology. Also, parallelly, there's a lot of statistics involved in all this. I don't want to go into detail. The camera trapping also gave us sightings of other creatures in the forest which were never seen otherwise. But identifying individual tigers gave you a very powerful tool. It is called capture-recapture sampling, originally invented by P.S. Laplace, the mathematician, to estimate the population of prawns from church registers. Then applied to fisheries by Peterson in Denmark in the late 19th century to estimate fish in a pond by marking fish pulling. Anyway, I don't want to go into that. Applied by wildlife biologists to count ducks from Lincoln in 1930s. So this had a statistical background, and I was lucky to work with the best in business, Dr. James Nichols, and we started using these very sophisticated models. So I had both tiger numbers measured accurately using capture-recapture photography, and I also had prey numbers from distance sampling. Then I went and wanted to survey this across India and to find out how we make this method. I went to Mr. Kamal Nath, or first I went to the director of Project Tiger. I want a permit. He said, no, I won't give you a permit because we already know the bug mark sensors. You don't have to do this. Then I went to Mr. Kamal Nath and he called the director of Project Tiger and said, let him do it. He's a cricket player. Your game is football. Let clear his file. So, I mean, these are all things you have to learn if you have to be a conservation biologist. Anyway, published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, US, which showed the clear correlation between tiger and prey numbers, and it's still, that paper cited a lot, it's useful. And it also, this long-term, we started doing long-term, year after year, long-term studies. This is called macroecology, across large spaces and over long periods. It's a very hard domain to penetrate, it's expensive, it's difficult. So very few macroecological studies are there. There are studies in Serengeti and places like that. This is probably the only one in India, 30 years in the same landscape. And we got histories of these tigers from the time of their birth to their death over years. And one thing was very clear from the data, that tigers are a very productive species. And they have very high birth rates, they have very high death rates. So this is why they could sustain the kind of losses from hunting that Mahesh has documented so beautifully. And we got dispersal over long distances from camera trapping. We started working over this entire landscape and then started, at that point, I felt doing science alone is not enough. So we got involved very heavily with the government, supporting enforcement, training forest guards, dealing with the issue of livestock killing by tigers and conflict and retaliatory killing by people. And one thing I found was that, going out and doing field studies is not in our culture. Very few people want to do it. But I did it the reverse way. I was doing field work, and young people who came and showed interest, I would take them to the field and torture them. And 90% would run away, never come back again. But the 10% who stayed on, today many of the biologists' names you hear, they all came through that process. It was like Guantanamo Bay. But they came out. And it was really boot camp sort of a thing. So that was one thing. I created a cadre of trained people who understood biology, and then they went out and And a lot of them were not even biologists. They were lawyers, journalists, and there's Praveen Bhargav, whose name you have. He was an advertising agency executive, but he became a full-time conservationist, coffee planter. So we had this massive network where we could really bring our social pressure on the DC, SP, the minister, whatever. The other thing that struck me when I was trained as an ecologist is that the number of animals, any mammal species, the diet and its home range are related. So when you suddenly look at this Nagarhole and find there are 5,000 people there in 600 square kilometers, it's very clear it's not going to work. That's not natural densities which human beings living off the land live. They were working as laborers, they were doing other things, packed in there and in miserable conditions. And they also were socially at the bottom of the pyramid. They were afraid of going out and they didn't know agriculture, plus they were more worried about dominant communities suppressing them outside. So they were reluctant to go out. So we were convinced that and we worked with the Chief Minister, Mr. Bangarappa, who did a terrific job of sanctioning the money. But the key thing was to convince them. And I found a tabloid journalist, was very good at all this, who had a passion. And I made him close his tabloid and hired him as my assistant director. He's still there. He's, in my opinion, a fantastic conservationist, PM Muttanna. And he was like a Pied Piper. He could interact with people. We would work with government, and slowly this caught up. And over a period of 30 years, we moved 2,000 people out of different protected areas completely voluntarily. But what we did was fight with the government and make sure they got what they had to. Government leakages were the problem. Performance of the government was bad. So we were being hammered from all sides. But in the end, we managed. But it meant, as a conservationist, you had to deal with the local Swamiji and everybody else. You can't be isolated and preach conservation. The best case was Bhadra, where 450 families were moved out. It took 20 years to make sure the land came together. The whole project took 30 years. But in the end, in 5 years, we had 450 families out, prospering. And my daughter Kriti she was a student at Yale then. She has monitored from that point their social indicators of their prosperity, and they are incredibly, guys who used to carry firewood on their head are driving Maruti cars now because it was fertile land and they worked hard. So when Jairam Ramesh took over as minister, he said, I want to go to Ranthambore and see tigers. I said, no, Jairam, please go and see Bhadra relocation. He flew there, and because he was from Chikmagalur, he was so impressed, he came back and made it more official policy, sanctioned more funds for it and all that. And we still keep track of these people. After 20, 30 years, we connect with them. And the habitat has come back. This area had 5 households and 500 cattle. Once they were moved out, it's reverted to its true nature, and there's Gaur. And this is a fantastic place called Kudremukh. And in 1976, a giant iron ore mine opened up there. And it was polluting the Bhadra river. It was causing tremendous damage. And we fought it in the Supreme Court and we won. It took, again, a lot of court cases against us. I can't go into detail. In that book, I have put some of this stuff. But in the end, I come back. You have done all this, but has it worked? For me, spending money, making people happy, etc. is not the key goal. That is for Mother Teresa or somebody else. For me, has it worked for wildlife? And that's where the monitoring and science come in. We had a 30-year monitoring, and the data show that these things have worked and wildlife has come back. I have the papers. I can't go through all the figures, but this is what it is. And it's a 50-year real-world experience of bringing back tigers. And as a consequence, today, just Bandipur and Nagarhole alone, 1,500 square kilometers, there are 200 tigers. And in that central Western Ghats, and all this was done on a shoestring budget compared to what the government is spending on monitoring. We did it at low cost. It worked. So the paper is there, I won't. So in the end, it comes to, as a schoolboy, when I was desperate to see tigers, as a college student, I went everywhere. I saw the tracks, but no tigers, gunshots everywhere. Tigers were always gone. hindsight, looking at the data, there were about 700 tigers, 70 tigers in that whole landscape of 20,000 square kilometers from Goa border to Mysore. Today, there are 350 to 400 tigers. Just look at that. It's not just this effort. Other things have happened. Economic growth has been phenomenal. It's not reversing economic growth. Development has proceeded. Major shifts have taken. People are not using animal protein anymore. Farm incomes have gone up to 600 rupees a day. People go and buy a chicken. They don't go and hunt. That major pressure is off. Wood fuel use is off. Not only it's saving women's lives because of that inhalation of smoke, people have switched to LPG. So the entire transportation has switched from oxen to small diesel vehicles. So this entire thing has transformed the landscape. So the development has had negative effects. It also has had positive effects. To me, it's very clear. You can't deny the benefit of development and say, I want to save tigers. You need to have, and these things happened in the same landscape. So to conclude, again, I don't want to go into it at great detail. Yesterday in the talk, I said, I think there are two things that one is an idea promoted by my former teacher and boss, John Robinson, which is called sustainable landscapes. He says, don't try for sustainable development everywhere. Have land partitioned for intensive production, whether it is agricultural, factories, mining. Have land earmarked for where some biodiversity and rural users can coexist, and save some space for these creatures which need areas where you don't. So it's using landscapes as a whole sustainably. The other idea was promoted and came up in the 90s, which is the folks in the Breakthrough Institute and all. So basically, don't reject. You can't solve this problem because the Earth's population will be 10 billion. Aspirations are more. People want to consume. If you tell them just to become austere, they're not going to listen. So decouple human users from nature. Use technology to do, I mean, one gross example would be, instead of wild meat, you have cultured meat. If you have energy from nuclear or some other source, it doesn't take much space. Energy density per unit area or per unit mass. How much energy do you? That's the key solution. Agricultural productivity. 2 women won Nobel Prize for gene editing, Carpentier and Doudna. And these can revolutionize agriculture production. Just think, if all the dams that are built, big dams, they have lifespans. One by one, they will die out. How are you going to produce food? You have to design plants that can produce the food. So unless you have this, reject this anti-technology kind of notions and really use wise technology, partition the land suitably, I still think you can do decoupling. I've seen examples of that. This is a very crude example, living example of 50 years in which tigers have come back in spite of not the perfect development, but the process. Don't view it as an enemy, somehow work with it. This is kind of the take home. And this sort of an eco-modernist view, not going back. And Mahesh, can I take one more minute? Just to wrap up, because I've seen 3 experiments in my lifetime of people saying, let's reject technology and go back to the old ways, and that's more harmonious. One was Gandhiji. Of course, he promoted it big time. But in terms of practice, other than celebrating his birthday by closing down bars, it's unimplementable. And Mao did the same thing with the Red Guards and simplifying, going to core of Marxism. Nobody practiced it. Within 10 years, Deng Xiaoping came and threw it all out. And my generation of people in the West, all hippie, counterculture, long hair, very simple lives, it's turned into Kardashians and this crass entertainment business. Nobody is living like a hippie and change the world. So I'm kind of convinced that you can't reject modernity and save tigers or nature. I think the two have to be done. It's difficult, but I think with good science we can do it. Thank you.
I was struck by one sentence. I never thought I would mention you and Steve Jobs in the same line. I think you beat him by a yard and a mile. He said, stay hungry, stay foolish. You said something of remarkable importance. You said, I did the craziest thing and it worked. And among the crazy things was 8 years of tractor sales and farming, many years going back to being a student in your 30s and doing a doctorate. And then in your book, there's one sentence I want to quote. You said, the more I got into the practice of conservation, I found I had less time for science. So what has kept you going while you've done the crazy things, besides your love of tigers, which has come through your passion so well?
Well, I think it's the same thing. There is some desire that sites like this, I have 2 granddaughters, they should also see it. So unless we fix the world, it's not going to happen. And it's primarily also the set of friends. I went through some court cases, all sorts of things. There's a bunch of friends, conservationist friends who stood with me, including Karnataka's leading lawyer who fought all my cases for free and things like that. So it's not that I did it alone, it's this, I had a network of converts to my religion in some sense.
Open for questions. We have time, we have almost 30 minutes. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. So traditionally, conservation science has been a reactive discipline, right? We tend to identify a threat and we stop that threat. But it seems that you're proposing a new vision, right? Where we can think of other goals. So can science inform such goals? So just to rephrase that, when will a conservationist be happy? Do they need more land, or do they need to reach a certain number of tigers?
Yeah, in some sense, we have to have a goal. When you set out to accomplish something, you have to have a goal. And Ed Wilson, the Harvard biologist, sitting in Harvard and studying insects, thinks half the world should be left for nature. I don't think we are at that stage, maybe 300 years later. Right now, I'll be happy with 10%, say for India. And so with that goal, how do we do it? I'm going again to tigers because it has to be rooted in something. 10% for mosquitoes is easy to achieve. 10% for tigers is very hard. It depends on the biology of the species. I think we can do that for tigers and some other species. There are 2 things going wrong now. We have 380,000 square kilometers of potential tiger habitat. I'm not talking of private land, I'm talking of purely government-owned land, in which only about 50,000 square kilometers has reasonable protection and tigers at reasonable density. The other 320,000 is neglected, not protected effectively. So the allocation of money and effort should be towards that, whereas what we are doing is dumping more and more money into the same areas. There are social reasons for it, I won't go into it. So clearly allocation of resources has to change if you have to have that world. Second thing is, a surplus population or a thriving population of tigers means it does produce some years annual surpluses. And there's no room for those tigers. And when there is conflict, we have to remember the conservationist job is not just recovery, but also addressing people's problems. And these animals should be immediately shot and eliminated in whatever manner you can. After the first incident of predation on humans, which is classical man-eating, not something that swipes and runs away. So we have to deal with human-tiger conflict with sympathy for local communities and not sympathy for the individual man-eating tiger. Sympathy for the species as a whole, because we want many more of them. And the third thing I can see is this involves land use change outside the government-owned. In the private landscape, agricultural landscape, can we change land use so it becomes wildlife friendly? Right now, our agriculture is very wildlife unfriendly. And I have seen examples of land use change at a scale. For example, in the Malnad, when tobacco came, it was more profitable. Switched a lot of land to tobacco from ragi or something. When arecanut came, paddy was replaced by arecanut because it had a huge market outside. So market is a powerful force. Coffee was the other one that came. So we should certainly use that approach of using incentives for making people land more friendly. And a good example I have seen in South Africa is, of course, different kind of lands, low rainfall. These were all too poor for agriculture. They had cattle ranches in South Africa, in Namibia. Over time, they switched to wildlife ranching because wild meat had a premium value and the wildlife survived the diseases better than cattle, and hunters would come and shoot elands or whatever and pay a ton of money. So whole landscapes changed towards ungulates, maintaining ungulates rather than one species of ungulate, the domestic cattle. And then came, because with the ungulates came the predators, and next came the lion and the guys who hunted sisal and people like that. So they paid even higher to shoot lions. So there were programs for that. And finally came the non-consumptive users of wildlife like photographers and naturalists and tourists. So many of these ex-hunting ranches have now become private reserves of 15, 20 square kilometer size, which is the typical area of a tourism zone in an Indian park. I think that's a powerful tool for India because we now have a 300 million strong middle class. There's so much money. People are willing to pay 50,000 rupees a night to stay in some of these places. And we are trashing the same places. So if we can have these kind of reserves of 15, 20 square kilometers where this flow of money, which is now, it's unbelievable the amount of money people are spending to go to this. If it can go directly to the owner of the land or a collective of owners, we can change land use just like we did with coffee and areca. But the complication comes because our average holdings are much smaller. So it's got to be much more complicated than assembling 5 ranchers. We are talking about 100 farmers. But I think we have a demographic shift. People are going to cities, many places they are not able to farm. So I think it's conducive. If some innovation can take place, we can change land use. And that's how we can then expand. Sorry, long answer.
So university's questions begin to the left.
Okay.
My name is Mayan Agarwal. My question was that I do not study biology. I am not plan to be a wildlife conservationist. Within that capacity, how do you think we can help? I can help.
I think you can help in conservation in very many ways without being a professional conservationist. I am a paid conservation scientist or a conservationist. That network I spoke about had cable TV operators of Madikeri, lawyers, journalists from any profession, because you all have ways of interacting with the society, putting pressure using your connections. If you are a journalist, for example, you can have a huge impact. But fundamentally, the problem I find is, if you look at the sector of social activists, we call, when they get in with all their heart, they also learn something about their profession and go. Amateur conservationists in India and journalists are completely ill-informed. So they don't know what to do. So if you know what to do, it becomes a different game. So I think the first step is to inform yourself as to what the problem is, because problems vary from site to site. But certainly investing, philanthropy of the American kind can play a huge role. We have a lot of philanthropists in India who are funding conservation, but they're giving more money to the same government, which already has too much money. So there are all these misalignments. So it is your social, your economic, your skills. You can contribute to any one of these.
Yeah, I'm Ghazala, professor at the EVS. So you propose this separation, but we've already seen it happen in many Western European countries, United States. Most of these developed countries have taken that approach where all the production is concentrated into smaller areas, urban centers are concentrated, but protected areas are very much separated from urban centers. But still you see a lot of problems. There are a lot of extinctions in process, a lot of songbird populations still going down. resistance to reintroduction of carnivores. I live in France in the last 2 years, and the forest bird densities are extremely low because of a wave of deforestation that happened in the medieval age. They haven't been able to bring it back. So do you think it's, seeing these examples, do you think it's workable, particularly in India where we still have a lot of land-dependent people?
Yeah, there are 3 papers by Robinson, which I'll leave with Mahesh. The issue is this, it's not 2, it is 3. 1, certainly you need energy, metallurgy, these very, very intensive uses, and perhaps very intensive agriculture with modern technology, that's a fraction of the land. Then there's another fraction where agriculture that's not as productive, or forestry or plantations, and some species could live there. And I think that landscape, there's a huge difference between India and the countries you spoke about. We do have places where hyenas and leopards and many species do exist on such landscapes, because our level of tolerance is very different. The attitude of a Western rancher or even a Frenchman to wildlife, it's very different. I think we can have these multi-use landscapes for many species. It is only for the others, like tigers, perhaps elephants and rhinos, which have high value. And so I think you need, I'm not saying the present protected area system is the template. It was created in an ad hoc basis. But if you plan it in a way that you avoid the most likely to develop and most developed areas and concentrate on saving landscapes under this frame in other places, I think it's doable.
My name is Abhay. Here.
Yeah.
I'm a history student at Ashoka. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask you about the poaching problem specifically. And that's because recently I went to Kaziranga, and they, over the past 10-20 years resolved the poaching problem by basically shooting down anyone who they saw was poaching. And something didn't sit right with me about that whole approach. So how do you counter that problem, and how did you counter that problem here?
No, Kaziranga is perhaps the most extreme case. The Asian rhino was found everywhere in the grassland belt extending from Corbett all the way into Burma. And the pressure for the medicine trade was there 50 years ago. So the rhinos were down to a few dozen in Kaziranga. And it was brought back through the system of patrolling. And as you say, if anybody is seen with a gun, they shoot. And the level of that was very intense in 1990s when I worked there. They would typically lose 1 rhino a month and shoot a couple of poachers a month. That level of thing was there. As long as the demand is there and people are paid enormous sums of money to shoot rhinos, we cracked down in WCS. We cracked down on a racket headed by Chinese in Tanzania through a local group. So these commercial hunters, like Veerappan, who was ivory hunter in Western Ghats, they can only be stopped with the use of force. There's no other way you can save them. Even today, there are people coming in choppers and killing rhinos and flying away in South Africa. So I don't think there'll come a time when those kind of commercial poaching it's very different from the other more widespread hunting, snaring. These are, people are not willing to risk their lives. So you crack down on them, but also give them something else to do. You can control this other kind of poaching. I think there are two approaches to it.
I am Shamweta. I'm a history student at the PhD history student. Anyway, thank you for the talk. My question was that how would you approach the problem of conservation in a landscape that is more fluid? And I'm talking about the Sundarbans, where the on-ground debate is often who needs more protection? Is it the people or is it the tigers? And talking to the villages, when I get the chance to do my fieldwork there, the problem is that they think that the tigers get more attention. because and there's also the constant threat of cyclones and of course floods. How would you approach the question of conservation? Like, thank you.
Sundarbans is lousy habitat for tigers, first thing. Okay? Sundarbans, it's slightly better than Siberia, but not much. It has the lowest densities of tigers because the prey density is extremely low, naturally very low. There are wild boar, there are cheetal, and there's a lot of hunting of the local prey species also, local hunting. So you have this situation where tigers are everywhere, but at extremely low density. The second thing is, everywhere else across their range, tigers have been hunted by humans for centuries. So there is a natural fear of human beings because of these drive hunting and various methods employed, not just sitting in a hide and shooting. That doesn't translate into social knowledge among other tigers that humans are dangerous. But if you have hunting beats and things like that, Sundarban terrain is so hostile, it was never done. So a large proportion, if not all, a significant proportion of the tigers there view human beings as legitimate prey. So if there are a single person going rather than 10, they will jump into a boat and take people. And this has a long history, and it's because of the terrain or whatever. Now what do? You have this area which is about 5,000 square kilometers roughly in India and 10,000 square kilometers in Bangladesh, which is under this type of habitat. So avoiding human use across the whole thing is almost impossible right now. So I would say that a fraction of it, whatever is socially acceptable, these kind of, I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of people going, 1 lakh plus number of people going, sleeping in boats, fishing, and a significant number of tigers view human beings as prey, and wild prey is scarce. It's kind of an ideal situation to create man-eaters in some sense. So I think in some zones should be off limit for human use, and in other zones, you have to, people are taking law into their own hands and killing tigers and all that. So I don't see a solution for that. But in the longer term, it is the same shift, demographic shift towards other occupations. People are moving to cities in Karnataka or Maharashtra or urban areas, not even cities. Women are pumping gas in a small town called Hunsur, which was unthought of. This movement is taking place away from these types of occupation, including fishing and things like that. So I'm hoping in the long run, I mean, it doesn't address the issue of climate and that, but I think this demographic shift towards easier occupations, more lucrative occupations will need to be looked at as a solution.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk and for being here. I'm Anushri, an environmental studies student. My question was about your field work in Nagarhole. A lot of tribes have their homeland in Nagarhole, like the Jenu Kuruba tribes and the Yarava tribes. And so my first question was, has your social interactions with these tribes also informed your scientific approach to conservation and your work? And my second question was that these tribes say that the people, forests, and animals are all equal, and this model of creating protected spaces without people is a colonial conservation model that India is adapting, and that they've faced a lot of abuse by the hands of the forest department in their resettlement. And that conservation, if it's at gunpoint, it's eco-fascist is one of the words that they've used. So I wanted to know that, like, as a conservation scientist, how do you address this question? And is this a question that still needs to be addressed, especially in India when so many tribes have their homelands in these forests, and which are becoming protected areas without people?
Basically, these people were doing shifting cultivation in the late 19th century. After that, laboring in the coffee estates and working in the logging industry. So what you call homeland was about 4,000 to 5,000 people involved in logging, shifting cultivation, and working in coffee plantations. So 5,000 people cannot be supported on 600 square kilometers of land if you want wildlife. So when I went there in 1967, they used to get outside hunters. I saw only 2 cheetal in Nagarhole when I went in 67. So you can allow that process to unfold, which has actually happened. If you go today to Jharkhand and all those Orissa and those places where this process that you describe as homeland and whatever they do, that process is continuing, and anything larger than a bread box is extinct in these forests. Nagaland exterminated its tigers by 1950s, 5-6 years after our independence. Now it's a value judgment. Whether you want that or not, it is a value judgment. I would not like India to be devoid of its fauna. So then whether you need force, whether you need violence and force in managing society. So let us say we shut down all the police stations around your Ashoka campus and see what happens. So if you don't think state-sponsored coercion should not be a part of policy per se, the logic then dictates that you should not have any police stations in Haryana. People are good, they have been living traditionally. So I think these are very naive simplifications of a complex reality. Use of force is a part of conservation. It's not all of conservation. There is abuse of power by officials. There is abuse of power by local leaders, panchayat chairmen who have, indulged in hunting. It's a very complicated situation. And I was there for 50 years, and I've been there for 50 years. I would challenge anybody. We were able to move about 600 families. And when we started moving, this whole colonial, all this stuff came. And as involved deeply with these people, I speak their language, I worked with them, all my staff, everybody was tribal. There was no energy left to counter this story. So what I did was to talk to them. And every one of them said, I need 5 acres of land, I need electricity, I need hospitals, I need transportations for my kids to go to school. To me, that is more authentic than someone else saying they want to live in their homeland. They want to live in their homeland, but their basic needs are these: agriculture, employment, income, Western medicine. None of these are traditional. And once we gave it to them in a satisfactory manner, they moved out. Not one single one has gone back. We worked with the government to make it happen. So I would go by their decision. There was one tribal young man, he was 17. He brought a whole gang of people, surrounded my lab and scribbled slogans against me and said, Ullas Karanth, this, that, and all that. I worked patiently for 40 more years. He moved out in 1998. He is now a leader of the tribal who are motivating others to move out. He contested the election on a JDS ticket. A tribal guy in a non-tribal constituency, he didn't win, but he got 15,000 votes. To me, that is the reality. I believe in empowerment in a sense that I want tangible evidence, because I've heard these stories a long time, and to me, the reality is what matters.
Last 2 questions.
Hello, doctor. Here, I'm Shreya. Here.
Yeah.
My question is about the disruption caused by linear infrastructure, especially highways and railways, and the current mitigation strategies we have against that, things like underpasses and overpasses. Do you think that's good enough? Number one. And number two, connected to connectivity, something like tourism. On one hand, it makes people more sort of concerned with wildlife and brings attention to that. But also, when you have places like resorts, they're equally disruptive. There's a large land, there's sounds and lights and all those things. So is that more disruptive, more good? What do you think about that?
I'll come to your first question, which is really critical, because I've been advocating economic growth and urbanization, the phenomena that are unfolding, and they be done more intelligently. So clearly, Western Ghats is a classical example. The coast is highly developed. Hinterland, Bengaluru, Hubli, whatever, they are developed, and the two have to remain connected. The problem is we are putting multi-lane highways, and they are going to finish the Western Ghats off. But you go to China, they have used technology not for conservation, but for efficient transportation. They have tunnels under these, or very high arch bridges. What we do as these underpasses, what you see in Pench, it's pathetic. That's not going to, it's neither prevents fragmentation nor does it work. I mean, as a small solution, it may work, but I think in major cases, I think the solution lies in more expensive but the right technologies which will solve the problem once and for all. I think it should all be tunnels through the Western Ghats, not highways. So I'm thinking of those. We have the money now. See, it wasn't money issue. Now we have the money. The second question pertained to tourism and its negative impacts. This is also important. It's because we are putting too many people into the same piece of land, too many vehicles, and the way it's run is pathetic. I think it needs to be managed differently. And but it does create a constituency for tourism, wildlife, even in this present messy state. Even the present messy state, the gypsy owner, it's built a constituency of support for the park. The same community that used to hunt wildlife now own gypsies, own homestays, own stuff. But it's a complicated situation. We need to manage it better, not reject it.
I'm very sorry.
You were talking about the empty forests in India, right? The empty forests in India, for example, you're talking about Arunachal as well, I think. So there's Namdapha and Moling, but the thing is, as you were saying, that the problems with the micro hydro projects that are now penetrating into Arunachal, Assam, they all pose a threat. I think Arunachal also went to 0 tigers in 2010 sometime. So now what are the projects that are taking place, and what, for example, in UK, they're reintroducing large cats. So is that something possible to think of in the Northeast Arunachal, whether the empty forest?
Reintroducing cats is a very complicated thing, and the prey is the issue in Arunachal. I camera trapped in Namdapha, 2000 trap nights in 1997. We had seen one tiger track, but we know not. Soon after that, they went extinct. Even now, the occasional animal that turns up there, I think they are dispersing from Kaziranga. They are not born there. So we are a long way off from bringing. But one really good example from Arunachal was this mass slaughter of Amur falcons in their roosting and in Nagaland. And it was Banu Haralo, who is a media person of Naga origin, and some ornithologists got together. They created a local movement. These millions of falcons were being shot and sold like chicken in the markets. And they created, within very quick order, a change in attitudes. It's now become a big tourist attraction, this Amur falcon congregations of lakhs of falcons, and people are making money from tourism. I think there's tremendous opportunity, because that biodiversity in that part of the world, although the large mammals are extinct, there is still so much, and the population is relatively small. I think innovative experiments, I think, can be done in Arunachal and Meghalaya and all these states. And the empty forest syndrome you talked about, it goes beyond that. All of Burma is like that. All of Laos is like that. All of Cambodia is like that. It's sad to see the biggest forest. Tigers went extinct when we were working in Cambodia, before our eyes.
So I have a last question, if I may. I'm very struck by the richness of the social, cultural, economic material brought to the fore when you're looking at the Malnad. And it does strike me as a student of society that if you draw a line across India, southern India, the per capita income is roughly that of Philippines. There are 2 large North Indian states, not Haryana. Haryana is a very developed state. One has the PCI of Mali, one has the PCI of Niger. The other is many of the changes you have described, sir. Roads, rural electrification, rise of the rural wage, ability of government also to provide that gas is much higher in these states. So do you think in India, peninsular India, actually much of what you're describing is a model that works given that setting? The same protective system doesn't seem to be working. I'm very struck, you referred to Central East India, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. Besides the heavy hunting, these seem a very different form of society. I mean, the power seems very raw. So I'm just wondering, are there 2-3 different kinds of scenarios happening? And is the scenario you've picked applicable in a vast area of land in Western and Southern India? But not only because of the conservation, but the larger social.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I'm not saying it's a panacea. It can be made to work in UP and Bihar suddenly. These were states with a lot of wildlife in the past, both UP and Bihar. It's going to be very hard to bring that in because of, I think education, so many factors are there. And in some cases, conservation fails. Like conservation is one business where there's a lot of BS going around. We don't have metrics of success. A businessman, whoever he is, has a balance sheet. At the end of the year, he has to say, I made a profit or loss. In conservation, we sell stories. We don't have metrics. What happened to the animal? Nobody has the answer. They have all these stories, beautiful brochures, and how we go and do this and that. But what happened to the animals? To me, that is the weakness of conservation. It's still not strongly science-based. So if we apply those yardsticks in these places, it will become very obvious.
So I'm sure that you all enjoyed the talk, and I hope you'll come back for a longer stay, 1.5 days as you thought, and have much more time. I'm sure there are many more critical questions. But thank you very much, and on behalf of
And the book has a lot of points. This book has, I've covered as much as possible some of the points.
Thank you so much.